Well, welcome back to the Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we journey chapter by chapter through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. This is chapter 8 of Prince Caspian, How They Left the Island. Welcome back, Phil.
Thanks. Good to be back.
We have a exciting episode. Are you feeling good about this chapter? We were kind of down on the last. Maybe it was really just me that was a little negative last time around.
Yeah, and it's a tense situation. We're building up a lot of stuff. We're still building up stuff in this chapter, but at least we're kind of moving a little bit. We're back. We're finally back to the Pevensies.
Oh, I know. We are finally back with the I've missed them a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, for listeners, it's been 8 weeks of not hearing us talk about the Pevensies.
Yeah.
So I know that people have really been dying to, have us get back here. So here we are. In the last episode, Miraz and his army were besieging the Narnians at Aslan's How. Trumpkin left to go look for the kings and queens to return as Caspian blew the horn. And now we're just starting off with his story. He's been telling the story for 4 chapters now, and now that story has ended, and we're back here with the Pevensies. So do you have a chapter summary for us?
I sure do. Let's go. Trumpkin reveals that it was Susan's horn that sounded between 9 and 10 o'clock, and the children realize that must be the thing that brought them back to Narnia. They are all eager to meet up with Caspian now that they have heard the story, but the dwarf, and he means no offense, doesn't seem to think that they will be of much help, seeing as they are children. Nevertheless, they all suit up with armor from the treasury, and while doing so, Peter and Edmund hatch a plan. Edmund asks the dwarf to show him what it's like to fight a real warrior, and, using the skill he gained from his previous battles, disarms Trumpkin. This, in combination with Susan besting him with a bow and arrow, and Lucy healing him with her cordial, convinces the dwarf of their ability, and they set off to meet Caspian.
That's a good one. I really like that.
Thanks.
So my initial thoughts with this episode, I just mentioned it a minute ago. I feel like I was kind of negative last time. And so I don't want to do that. And so I want to start off with a positive takeaway, which is that I think this is a great chapter for younger readers. And that sounds me. I don't mean that pejoratively. I really think this is a great chapter to read with 8, 9, 10-year-olds. I think it's exciting to see the Pevensies show off their gifts and talents again through this competition, and I think it teaches the valuable. It sounds cliche, but it's a valuable lesson of not judging a book by its cover.
Right.
What are your takeaways?
I really like right from the start. The first sentence is, "And so said Trumpkin, for as you have realized, it was he who had been telling all this story to the 4 children, sitting on the grass in the ruined hall of Cair Paravel." He really confirms something, but he also affirms the reader at the same time. And I think that fits into what you're saying about how this is great for children, because maybe they were suspecting it, but he says this in such a way that they're like, yeah, I did know that the whole time.
Yeah. Well, let me say a couple of my criticisms of the chapter, at least things I didn't love. And that was that I hate that we leave the island on the last page. I really wanted us to kind of move the story forward. And I feel like the kids, the Pevensies, are kind of dragging their feet here. And that might be what Lewis is trying to do with them. We spent 4 chapters with Caspian and the old Narnians. And all the things we've learned in the last 4 chapters really don't affect this chapter at all. Now, they obviously will down the road, but they don't really affect the Pevensies here. All that the Pevensies learn is that it's Trumpkin, who was the dwarf, which I think most readers have figured out. I don't know about 8 and 9-year-olds, but I think a lot of you and I reading as adults, you figured this out already. And we learned that it was indeed the horn that brought them back. But like you said, most people have probably already figured that out. And those aren't I don't think this is at all a bad chapter, but it's just and this is to Lewis's credit. I just really want to get these 2 parties together. I want Caspian and the Pevensies to get together, and it's just I'm having to be patient.
So to me, I think that's what makes this chapter so good.
Yeah.
And the whole book so far is that, you really want to get to the action part, but you're kind of stuck on an island, and now you got to walk a really long ways to get there. I think that we're really building up the anticipation, and I'm really excited for chapter 9.
And it actually reminds me, I've got another point to make to this in a little bit. I thought a lot about The Empire Strikes Back when we were reading this chapter, and one of the things as a kid that really frustrated me about The Empire Strikes Back is I'm like, I can't see Luke and Han and Leia together for the whole movie. Like really after they leave Hoth, the three of them are not together again. And I was like, oh, spoiler alert from 1980. Sorry about that, guys. But I like that same thing is happening to me here now as an adult. I'm like, I want to get all my heroes together. I want to get all my toys together playing in the same place, right? And Lewis is making me be patient here. So maybe my criticism is more of a reflection on my lack of patience, right? And it probably really is. And it's not really any poor writing on his part at all, because it's a wonderfully written chapter. But I'm just really itching to get these two groups of people or animals together. So we start off, like you said, with Trumpkin, revealing, it was I who's, he doesn't say it himself, but Lewis tells us. And the Pevensies come to the realization that, wait, Caspian blew the horn between 9 and 10 o'clock, and that's when we were standing on the platform. What do you make of this, Phil?
First of all, I think it's hilarious that that's Susan's horn.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be for her to use, and then she gets to call help.
I love that juxtaposition. Yeah,
it's awesome that they're the ones who get called in. Which, what if Susan was there earlier and she blew the horn? Would she just be like, well, I guess I can help myself?
Well, no, I don't think it necessarily has to call the Pevensies. I think it calls for help. And at this point, it calls for them. I think a good question would be to ask is, why doesn't the horn just summon Aslan, right? You would think. I think it makes sense to us as readers why, Aslan is not going to be kind of at the beck and call of a magical horn. But you would maybe think that would probably be the most helpful person to come, or animal to come. But instead we get the Pevensies who do not return as their old, adult selves. They return just as being kids again. So you kind of get why Trumpkin would be, pretty disappointed to be like, oh, a bunch of kids, Right. I think it is a little weird, not bad, but it is odd that, over 1,000 years have passed. And so these timelines don't line up at all between England and Narnia, yet somehow they're in the same time zone.
Oh, that is weird, yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, oh yeah, we're 1,300 years removed from y'all, but still 9 o'clock.
It must be a very precise matching up.
I kind of like that. Yeah, I'm not making fun of it.
That
is
really bothering me the more I think about it, though.
Yeah, it's I think it is a little silly, but I kind of like it. To me, it shows there is no timeline. It doesn't line up. It is just magic. You can't be like, oh, well, this many days on Earth, this many minutes in Earth equals this many days in Narnia or something like that, because some things line up and some don't. And it makes it's the very magical connection between these worlds. It is not scientific at all.
Yeah. Well, on that note, though, have you've heard of CinemaSins?
Oh, yeah, I know.
Yeah, I know you're not a huge fan, but
I am not.
The stuff they point out, you're like, whoa, that is a really good point. How did that work? But when you're in the middle of a story, you're not necessarily thinking here's a perfect example. Every time there's a bomb in a movie and it's counting down from 2 minutes, there's no way that's exactly 2 minutes from when it starts counting down, because they're fitting the emotional. They're fitting all this stuff into the movie, and sometimes it seems like two things are happening at the same time, but they're actually a little bit offset. It wouldn't make sense if they're happening at the same time.
Yeah, but that's what I'm here. We're not going to get an argument about CinemaSins. You are right though. That is an issue, and so
I think what matters here is that they made the connection, and maybe later they're walking to go meet up with Caspian. Wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. It's been 1,000 years.
Yeah, I think it's a cool connection, and it's interesting that that's the way that they finally figure out what it is. It's it's Edmund realizing, wait, what time was it? They've almost forgotten that it would make perfect sense for them to be called back. They're the kings and queens of old. And yet it's when he realizes, they're at the same time as us. You know what? I bet there's a connection between that. Not Caspian's calling for help and then we magically appeared. It's the time thing. So I think it also shows, I don't know if that's humility or just kind of, on Edmund's part, being away for this long they've forgotten a little bit of who they are. Which actually, I think when they're later during the sword fight, we learn that Edmund has forgotten and he has to kind of relearn some stuff.
Comes back, yeah.
I really, really love as Trumpkin is telling his story when he tells us about his journey to get here to the island, that he says he cuts across an open country to cut off a big loop of the river, and he was caught. And he says, not by the army, but by a pompous old fool who has charge of a little castle which is Miraz's last stronghold toward the coast. I needn't tell you they got no true tale out of me, but I was a dwarf and that was enough. And I think this is really great Narnia world building. This is the kind of way that C.S. Lewis builds his world. It's not, we get that, if this was Tolkien, we'd get that castle's name, and like it would only use like really proper nouns describing how he was getting around. And that's not really how Lewis writes. It's more of, we just now know there's some kind of castle that's connected to Miraz. It's his last stronghold, but he's kind of off doing his own thing. And he obviously has a prejudice against dwarfs, just that being enough that he would capture Trumpkin as a Narnian. I think this is great classic Narnia world building. It just gives us a sneak peek that there's a much bigger world out there than what we're seeing in our story.
Yeah. And that it's a character that the character that captured him is like doing the thing that the Incredibles make fun of. It's like he has to like do this like big grand, like I beat you and you're going to have this kind of execution.
Oh, yeah.
And it gets the best of him.
It's so fun, and this is why I really, really love the way that Lewis builds Narnia. Is like, I'm sure that if you and I were thinking about this, the lord of this castle, whoever, the fool that's in this castle, we'd both be thinking different things, and maybe that person looks different to you and I, and like the way that they interact with Trumpkin would be so different. And Lewis doesn't really give us any of that, and I really enjoy that I get to kind of make up what this person looks like.
Also love Trumpkin's lobsters and lollipops.
Lobsters and lollipops.
If we had started with this book, that may be the podcast name.
Oh, we would call it lobsters and lollipops. It'd be really hard for people.
Reference.
Yeah, it's really hard for people searching for the show, looking for Narnia.
Not as hard as Lamp Dash Post listener.
That's true. I really, really love as they go along, and Edmund's talking about kind of how weird it is for them to be. They're kind of almost like the genies being called out of the lamp, and like what's really happening. They're being the ones summoned into a magical world, not kind of...
He doesn't like it.
Yeah, what's really interesting is there's a great line, too. He's like, it's uncomfortable that we can be whistled away for like that, right? And he says this great line, which has aged wonderfully. Do you know what it is?
It's worse than what Father says about living at the mercy of the telephone.
70-some years later, and that... Right. C.S. Lewis is ahead of his time. We're not the first people to obviously make that connection, but I mean, this is a brilliant man. He's literally, it's almost like a fourth wall break. He's turning to us as the audience, as being like, yeah, so you shouldn't live at the mercy of a telephone. And how ironic is he's writing in the late 40s, early 50s, and here in 2019, that's still just as relevant.
I've heard two stories now of kind of late 90s when cell phones were just starting to become more popular.
Sure.
And people were afraid of having a leash. It was like a leash. Like, oh, I have this thing with me all the time, and now I can be reached at any time, and I may have to like go do something as a result. And I don't feel like that's as much of a fear. Maybe it's because we're getting cell phones at an earlier age where it's like more of a privilege at the time. But that's a hilarious thing considering when this was written. It was 45, 46?
It was released in 51, so I'm assuming it's written around, I don't know the exact time. One of our listeners can let us know, but I would assume 49, 50, right around there or so.
Yeah.
All right, so moving on, Trumpkin is pretty disappointed with who has come to Narnia, and that he's got 4 pretty much kids on his hand. Not pretty much, they are children, and he really is just not believing that they can be of much help. He has that great line where he's like, no, we like kids and all. It's just I really like that. He's we're awfully fond of children and all that, but just at the moment, we're in the middle of a war, and I think that's a really, really great line where he's like trying not to be mean. He has grown to respect them, and he's like, I know what you guys used to be, but that's not who you are now, and you can't really do us any good. And
what a great way to communicate a character who really doesn't want to offend, but the more he says it keeps offending them.
Yeah.
So he's like, no, pray, don't be offended. I assure you, my dear little friends. It's like, oh, you're making it so much worse.
Oh, and then Edmund he's like, you're one to call us little, right?
Yeah. And then it's like, oh, this conversation's like getting
getting out of hand. So Peter has a wonderful idea here where he's like, we're going to prove that we still can do all of these things by kind of using the dwarfs. I don't know if it's his arrogance or his ignorance.
Ego.
Yeah, just to their benefit. We're like, we're just kids. We don't often have a great chance of meeting such a great warrior like you are. Why don't you show us,
some Dale Carnegie stuff there.
Yeah. Like, why don't you show us how to fence well and stuff? And Trumpkin's response is, yeah, but these swords are kind of sharp. I don't know if you could handle them, little buddy, right?
And Edmund has a great response.
You want to read it?
Yeah. I know, said Edmund, but I'll never get anywhere near you, and you'll be quite clever enough to disarm me without doing me any damage. That's so good.
And it's just, they're just playing him. Do you think Trumpkin is completely oblivious that they're playing him at this point?
I think that Trumpkin is slightly aware of his pride.
Okay.
And he does want to find out if there's really something to. I think he's halfway to having his mind changed. Is that right? That's a
Sure.
weird way to say it, but
I know, I understand what you're trying to say.
He now understands that, like, I didn't think that any of this stuff was real, and these people teleported from somewhere else.
Yeah, so part's real.
So that part's real, but they're still children. But, what's the harm in seeing where this goes? I'm pretty good with the sword. But then by the time he gets to Lucy or Susan shooting the bow and arrow, he already knows. He's already seen her archery.
He's a very skeptical believer, but now he's like, obviously, you four are standing right in front of me, so I have to believe these stories. But, you're also little kids. And so it's hard for me to fully believe. And so these kind of trials that he goes through help him become a true believer. So the fencing competition is between Trumpkin and Edmund. This is kind of the first trial. And C.S. Lewis writes this, and I love this. I don't think Edmund would have had a chance if he had fought Trumpkin 24 hours earlier. But the heir of Narnia had been working upon him ever since they arrived on the island. And all his old battles came back to him, and his arms and fingers remembered their old skill. He was King Edmund once more.
So good.
It's so good. And it goes back to you and I talking in the very first chapter. I love that we felt like Lewis was dropping a couple of breadcrumbs. A big question you and I had all along with the first couple of chapters is, what do the kids bring with them? I think we had the question of if you could swim, if they learned to swim as adults in Narnia, could they still just jump in the water now and be able to do that? And so we're learning that the answer to that question would be they don't automatically remember it, but even just after one day here, it comes back to them. It's almost like something they've forgotten. So those skills, those abilities, those memories are there, but they're almost buried just a little bit.
Right.
I love that. That's so cool.
Yeah. Have you ever had that happen?
No, I've never gone to a magical land and then returned a year later and then see if I remember all the stuff from before that. Yeah.
No, I mean, have you ever remembered how to do something while you start, from 10 years ago, while you start trying to do it again?
I think of if I were to, I can go back and find music I listened to in the early 2000s as a teenager, and all of a sudden I haven't listened to a song in 10 years.
And they know
I know
the words.
every word to the song, and it's I haven't thought about this song. I'll go on Spotify and I'll find a 2000s emo band playlist. And I'll feel I'm showing my cards now. I'll listen to a Dashboard Confessional song that I haven't heard in literally 15 years, and I know every single word of it. It's that's taking up space in my brain. Not that I'm upset about it, but it's how I haven't thought about this in 15 years. I hear it once, and I know every single word.
Yeah.
So I feel like it's a similar thing to that, where once you kind of get back into the swing of things, you're this is all there still.
Right.
Has that happened to you before?
Yeah, I think for me...
What emo band were you forgetting?
I was My Chemical Romance.
There you go. Yeah, Helena.
It's about a grandmother. His grandmother.
So C.S. Lewis describes this kind of fencing competition. I think it's a really cool thing. And obviously Trumpkin loses. Edmund gets the best of him. He kind of swings the sword out of his hand with this new trick that Trumpkin has never seen before.
It's just that's another great personality trait to give this character, where he's clearly been beaten, but he can't quite admit it.
Oh,
so they give him a way out each time, but he takes less and less of that as the story goes on.
Yeah. Are they... Well, let's compare this, because the next one is Susan with the bow and arrow. They're shooting at an apple that's so far away it looks like a cherry. So, I mean, I don't know how far that is, but it's got to be really far off. This is a pretty impressive feat that Susan accomplishes here, but she is nowhere near as happy to beat the dwarf or to beat Trumpkin as Edmund is. And I like comparing these two characters, but do you think in general the Pevensies are going a little too easy on him? I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's just because I'm prideful, but I'd be I used to be the king here, and you're literally making me prove to you that? And I don't know. Especially when you're 12 years old, I think I'd be even more arrogant.
Yeah, I think we're forgetting their ages, but maybe that's part of it, because last time they were in Narnia, they were in their 30s and 40s.
No, they were in their 20s.
20s and 40s.
Yeah. I really enjoy the way that Susan kind of handles all of this, where, you know, she's not mean about it. She actually feels kind of bad. I think it's a great show of her character, and she's your favorite Pevensey, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned that before. You're not convinced now.
Not so much right now.
Okay.
I think that when she goes, it wasn't really any better than yours. I think there was a tiny breath of wind as you shot.
You don't like that.
That makes it way worse.
Yeah.
It's like, no. And like he actually like called her out. He's like, no. It's like, no, there wasn't. Don't tell me. I know when I'm fairly beaten.
Yeah.
That's a great response from him.
I like that it shows us that Edmund's probably a little too arrogant here, which I like that in Edmund. I think that's a fun quality for him, especially because, and this is an interesting thing. Let me go off on a tangent just for a second. One thing I've really enjoyed about Prince Caspian is that Edmund really is almost like a new character, because in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, his main character arc is to go from being this annoying little brat to then a traitor to then someone who asks for forgiveness. But really, we don't see a ton of who Edmund is after, after he goes back to Aslan's side. He really doesn't have a huge part to play in that. He's part of the battle and stuff, but he's still, it's a new character. And so it's almost, that's not who Edmund is anymore. And so it's almost like Edmund, to me, is a new character. And we're kind of like, we know who Peter is. We know who Susan and Lucy are. But I'm not quite sure who Edmund is now that his main quality isn't, he's just a traitor. Right. And so it's kind of fun to see Edmund is kind of still, he's not this, little annoying jerk, but he still has a little bit of the arrogance. He's still living a little bit in Peter's shadow. And so he's happy. He's more than happy to be the one that gets to show off to Trumpkin with his fencing skills. I assume Peter could have also won this as well, but instead we put Edmund.
That was one of my favorite parts.
Yeah.
The reasoning why. Do you remember that?
No, what's the reason?
So Lucy heard Edmund say, no, let me do it. It will be more of a sucks for him if I win, and less of a letdown for us all if I fail. All right, Ed, said Peter. That's so wise.
Yeah, that's cool. I really like that.
Yeah.
One of the things that's interesting about all of this, and this will move us into, after Susan wins, Trumpkin's like, I'm not going to be taken for a fool again. I suppose you're likely to be a great surgeon, when he's talking to Lucy. What's interesting, because Lucy he has kind of a wound that Lucy uses her cordial to treat.
Classic cortisone shot.
Yeah. What's really interesting is that each of the four kids, each of the Pevensies uses their gifts and talents to show off to Trumpkin. It's obviously easy for the first three. Edmund is sword fighting. We see that's very clear. Susan is archery. Lucy uses her gift from Father Christmas to heal him. But Peter, at first glance, you might think that he's just left out. We don't see Peter use any of his talents here. But for me, this is Peter showing us why he's the High King, because it's his decision-making and delegating that has all of this happen. Peter's kind of the leader who's like, not just a leader because he tells you what to do. He's the leader because he puts the right people into the right positions for them to be successful. And that to me is like, wow. And that's Peter's using his gifts as the High King, his talent as a leader to help his family succeed. I think that's really, really cool.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah.
I was kind of wondering about him.
Because it does, at first glance, you feel like he's just left out. Like, he's the High King and he's just sitting by watching. He's being lazy. He's like, no. He is the leader who's working behind the scenes to set up his people for success. Yeah. It's really cool. So after he's healed, Trumpkin says giants and junipers, but might be one of my least favorite ones. It's not quite as, it doesn't have the alliteration.
Yeah, I get that.
So as all this is unfolding, Trumpkin gets the new nickname, Dear Little Friend, DLF. What do you think about this, Phil?
Not a huge fan.
Yeah, look at the face you just made.
Who might have judged?
I think it's weird.
I don't like when they say the DLF.
Yeah, it honestly, it feels very non-Narnian to me, and it feels like, and this makes sense because the Pevensies are not Narnians; they're from England. Like this, saying the DLF to describe a magical, like literally using an acronym to describe a magical creature like a dwarf, feels very non-magical to me. But that's the whole point, because the Pevensies aren't from here, so maybe that's kind of the
It
thing.
is funny how they flipped it on him because he called them that.
Yeah, absolutely. So after Trumpkin has received his nickname, they decide they're going to go head off to Aslan's Howe, and I love kind of just the uncertainty of what lies ahead for the Pevensies, because so Aslan's Howe is obviously the stone table, right? And there's now we got to go across the fords of Baruna. Trump was like, no, that's Baruna's bridge. And Peter's, there's no bridge in our time. And then we can get around here because we got around here easily before. And he's like, well, no, that's woods now. Oh, and there's enemies. It's just kind of like, oh man, this is a very different Narnia than the Pevensies are used to. And so it gets me excited for this upcoming journey because the Pevensies are going through Narnia almost like it's their first time all over again.
Right.
And as they're leaving, I want to read this section of the text because I think it's just a really, really beautiful depiction of Narnia. It's one of those things where it's nothing new, but it's just good, old, wonderful Narnia. And so I'm going to read it here. And this is the Pevensies as they're on the boat leaving the island. And soon the green wooded coast of the island was falling away behind them, and its little bays and headlands were beginning to look flatter, and the boat was rising and falling in the gentle swell. The sea began to grow bigger around them and, in the distance, bluer, but close round the boat it was green and bubbly. Everything smelled salt, and there was no noise except the swishing of water and the clop-clop of water against the sides and the splash of the oars and the jolting noise of the rowlocks. The sun grew hot. It was delightful for Lucy and Susan in the bows, bending over the edge and trying to get their hands in the sea, which they could never quite reach. The bottom, mostly pure, pale sand, but with the occasional patches of purple seaweed, could be seen beneath them. It's just like old times, said Lucy. Do you remember our voyage to Terebinthia and Galma and the Seven Isles and the Lone Isles? Yes, said Susan. And our great ship, the Splendor Hyaline?
Hyaline.
With the swan's head at her prow and the carved swan's wings coming back almost to her waist. And the silken sails and the great stern lanterns and the feast on the poop and the musicians. And I just love all of this because it just reminds me of why I love Narnia so much. When you were reading it, did any of this stick out to you, or did you just kind of read through it?
It's just a really nice moment.
Yeah.
And it seems like the kind of quiet moment with a great description that these books are known for.
Yeah.
Even though there's not too many of these moments.
Not in this book, no.
Yeah.
It gets me also really, really excited for the voyage of the Dawn Treader. Just having Lewis describe the ocean and the water. I'm so excited for next season when we get to go through the Dawn Treader because it's like the whole book is that. So I'm really excited for it. So that's where the chapter ends. Phil, do you have any other thoughts?
The very last line where Lucy has just asked, "Can't I row for a bit?" And Peter says, "The oars are too big for you." And Lewis describes the way he's talking. He said Peter shortly, not because he was cross, but because he had no strength to spare for talking. It really demonstrates how difficult it is to do what they're doing. Because a lot of travel and a lot of books and movies, it's like, oh, okay, we got to get over here.
Yeah.
That was tough. Got to get on a plane. But this is like, no, this is real work. And it seems like they're trying to almost take a shortcut to get there faster.
Yeah, well, it's also a character moment for Peter because I could see Peter at the beginning of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe being short and cross just because he was, tired, or just because he wanted to be the one in charge. And yet here it's not that same thing. And so there has been some development in his character.
Yeah.
I also have a question about the novel's theme. So we talked a couple of times already that C.S. Lewis said that this whole book is about restoring the true religion, it's the restoration of the true religion after corruption. So every just couple of chapters, I want to see if we have any update on that. Do you feel like any of that we touched on that theme at all in this chapter?
I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are on that. I'm not sure off the top of my head.
I mean, I think I was thinking about it. I didn't actually think about this until we started recording and talking about it, but I do see this a little bit in Trumpkin. I think about often the Christian walk for many people and who maybe if you don't grow up in a Christian home or you grew up outside of kind of Christianity being a part of the culture you grew up in, very much like Trumpkin is like he's heard of these fairy stories and stuff. He's not super familiar with them, and he's slowly kind of walking through like, okay, I can believe in this, but I'm not fully believing in that. I mean, I think about it as C.S. Lewis as he goes from atheist to theist to Christian. That's kind of what Trumpkin's doing a little bit, and I could see that being part of the restoration of this true religion, if you will, right? That it takes time. It's not like Aslan just shows up in front of Trumpkin's face and is like, believe in me, right? Like that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
It slowly happens over time. And I think this is true for many Christians. Their walk of faith or even coming to faith doesn't. Now, some people very much have like a come to Jesus moment kind of thing, but that's not how it works for everybody. And so I kind of see that Trumpkin is taking that path where it takes time and it takes multiple. It's like it's not just he goes from non-believer to full-on believer in one day or one experience. He kind of goes slowly along that path.
Yeah, all the evidence kind of adds up for him, and then, but once he's in, he's fully in. He's like even kind of laughing about it. He's like, okay, I believe you guys.
Well, this is a great question for you. Do you think Trumpkin is fully in at this point? Is he fully bought in?
It appears that way.
Okay,
but the way you're framing it makes me have a little bit of
no. I'm just wondering what you. I mean, I read this just thinking he's still skeptical. He's not someone who's ready for that, if you will, that true religion to return to. But he's like, it's kind of the only option I have right now. Like, so I'll go with this because it benefits me, but not. I'm not sure if I'm, if he's going to be willing to give his life for Peter. You know what I mean?
I think he's a character who, once he sees stuff, then he can change his mind.
Okay.
So
yeah.
He's definitely all in for the children, but he hasn't seen Aslan. But I think he's now more willing to believe that that's a possibility. He just hasn't seen him yet.
I could see that. I like that connection. That's good. So that's where we'll end this episode for today. Trumpkin and the Pevensies are leaving the island, and next time we're going to be back with Chapter 9, What Lucy Saw, and in that chapter, the Pevensies will continue their journey with Trumpkin towards Aslan's How. So I feel that about wraps us up, but we do have some listener feedback to get to. We had an email from Richard. He wrote, "Hi guys, I wanted to thank you for your podcast. It's been such a joy and blessing listening to you. The way I found Narnia is this. I didn't learn about Narnia until I was an adult. Having served in the military for about 5 years, I went off to college. During holiday at home, my brother played the BBC version of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This was in the mid-90s. I was mesmerized. After I returned to school, I went to the library and found the Chronicles. I read them and reread them. When I was able to find the BBC videos, I watched all of them. Narnia is a country I've come to love as an adult, never having ventured there as a child."
Cool.
Isn't that really cool?
I'm glad he found it when he did.
I think it's really cool, Richard, that you uncovered Narnia through the BBC version first. Like, I think that's, I don't know anyone else who, I know people saw like the Disney version for movies.
And then read the books.
Yeah, and then read the books, but I think that's a cool kind of stepping, especially because the BBC version is so similar to the book.
Right.
That's a really interesting kind of entryway. He also then followed up that he loved the episode with Emily and hearing about her and my Christian heritage, and said he'll keep listening, which we really appreciate. I'm not going to read. He also said he was surprised that I liked The Last Jedi, but we're not going to get into that.
We are abstaining from Last Jedi conversations.
What's funny is throughout all of this, you also really like The Last Jedi, but I have taken... What?
I really do. Yeah.
I've taken most of the beating from our fans as far as The Last Jedi goes. But Richard, thank you so much for reaching out. We're really, really glad that you're enjoying the show, and we're glad to have you along for the journey. Phil, do you want to wrap us up?
Sure. All right. Well, you can follow us into Narnia on our Twitter and Facebook pages. If you have any feedback, please email us at thenarniapodcast@gmail.com, or feel free to leave us a voicemail at 406-646-6733. We'd also love a review on Apple Podcasts. This helps other listeners find the show and join our read-through. Also, make sure you have subscribed to the show in your favorite podcast app so you can wake up to a new episode every other Wednesday. Our show's themes were created by Kevin MacLeod, and you can find more of his work in the links in the episode's description. Thank you for coming along on this journey, and we'll be back next time for Chapter 9.